We are now dealing with the vertebra. We have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 1 sacral. We're going to be looking at the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar first. Sacrum is really the last thing that we're going to be looking at. The first thing you want to do to identify that you're dealing with the cervical is the cervical are going to be the only ones that have this little hole on the side called transverse foramen. So this right here is going to be the transverse foramen, okay? So here's a transverse foramen, here's a transverse foramen. Only cervical have that. All of them have this one in the center called the vertebral foramen. So here's a vertebral foramen of a cervical, this is a vertebral foramen of a thoracic, and this is a vertebral foramen of a lumbar. But again, the only one that has this transverse foramen is this right here, which is the cervical. Okay, so this is a transverse foramen. You can also know that this is a cervical because the artery that passes through this transverse foramen you can see right here, and this is called the vertebral artery. So one of the questions I could ask you on the test is name the artery that passes through the through the transverse foramen, and your answer would be vertebral artery. Okay, I could say the vertebral artery passes through the blank, and the answer would be transverse foramen. Okay, so this again is a cervical vertebra. So that's the cervical. The other way to identify the difference between thoracic and lumbar is a couple of ways. Number one, thoracic looks like the head of a giraffe. Okay. The head of a giraffe.
It really does, though.
And then the other one is the lumbar looks like a moose, a little bit. Not quite as clear as the thoracic does, like a giraffe, but you still can kind of see it. Now that's a nice, sort of easy way to do it, but sometimes it doesn't always work out that clear, and it may not be that clear on the exam. Again, it sort of depends on which one I pick that day. But another definitive way, which is really the ultimate way to tell, is that the thoracic, if you look at the superior articular facets, which is this part right here, okay, it's superior because it's on the superior part of the bone, and articular because articulation means joint, and facet is usually smooth. It's an articulation point. The superior articular facet, this part right here, is smooth, and it faces in the same direction as this thing right here called the spinous process. This right here, if you look right here of a lumbar, the superior articular facets point medially. Okay, so this lumbar is going to point medially, the superior articular facet, and for thoracic, it's going to point posterior, same direction as this right here, the spinous process. So I'm going to go through typical vertebra and what they have in common, and then we'll go through the things that are different. First off, here we have the body of the vertebra. Here we have the transverse process, and this right here is the spinous process. So body, transverse process, spinous process, okay? Connecting the body to the transverse process is this right here, which is called the pedicle. So here's the pedicle. Connecting the transverse process to the spinous process is this right here called the lamina. So if you look up on the board, I actually wrote it out for you. Here we have the body, here we have the transverse process. Connecting the body to the transverse process is the pedicle. Here we have the spinous process and the transverse process. Connecting those two parts is going to be the lamina. And again, in the center is the vertebral foramen. Now that exists in both the thoracic and the lumbar vertebra. So here is the lumbar vertebra. This is the body. This is the transverse process. This is the spinous process. Okay. This right here would be the pedicle, and this right here would be the lamina. Okay. And then in the center is vertebral foramen and vertebral foramen. If we look right here, this is a cervical. Here is the body. Here is the transverse process. Here is the spinous process. This is the lamina. So again, spinous process, lamina, transverse process, okay, transverse process, body, and then connecting the body to the transverse process is going to be this right here, which is your pedicle, okay, and this in the center is your vertebral foramen, and this right here is your transverse foramen, okay. Stop it.